Welcome back to Financially Speaking. With me is Sheldon Pollack. He's an assistant professor at the University of Delaware. He was with us roughly a year ago. You just published a book on tax policy.
That's right.
If I give it an expertise, it's obviously on tax policy.
That's right.
And involved in the University of Delaware and a whole lot more, right?
That's correct.
Everybody has an opinion. We just had 11 minutes of Eleanor Craig and Social Security. When you look at Social Security, briefly, your thoughts on Social Security?
Well, my colleague Eleanor is quite correct. There's a financial imbalance in Social Security, and she's correct in identifying the source of it. I'm not so sure I would agree with those people who argue that we need to privatize the Social Security system. There are ways to fix the problem. The problem is a shortfall in revenue 20 years out in the future. Right now, Social Security produces about a $60 billion a year surplus, and in part, that's collapsed into the federal budget, and it makes our federal budget for the rest, everything that's non-Social Security, look a lot less worse than it really is. The reason we're showing a mild surplus, possibly for fiscal year 98, is because we're getting $50–60 billion of that surplus from Social Security. That's going to change in about 20 years. It's going to turn around and become a deficit. It would be unwise to wait 20–30 years to fix it then. And she's correct, and people that are pointing towards a crisis are correct to get us thinking about it. It doesn't have to be a crisis, though. There are solutions. Solutions don't have to be privatization. I don't think we do want to raise the wage tax any higher. 15.3% is pretty high right now. That's Social Security and Medicare. You wouldn't really want to tax existing workers at a higher rate right now to pay for their grandparents and parents playing golf in Florida.
Absolutely.
That does create a political problem.
Stay there, though, because the word came up 2 or 3 times. Let's talk about it. The key word, you're a guest tonight, that's being floated in Washington now is surplus. Tell us about this surplus. Is it real? Is it accounting?
It's real, but what the surplus measures and what a deficit measures is very misleading. It's not an accurate guide to really anything.
Is not?
It is not. It does.
Why?
It's basically a meaningless number. What the budget is, when we say we have a small deficit or a small surplus, that's simply an annual accounting of government outlays versus revenues. And our projection for 98 is that we'll be about even, maybe even have a small surplus. But that doesn't take into account in any way accrued benefits that aren't current benefits.
Such as?
Such as Social Security,
Okay.
which is an obligation that the government would have. All the so-called entitlement programs are mandatory payments by the government to people that qualify: military pensions, Social Security. These are programs, even educational programs, credits, that we don't really know how many people are going to be qualified 5 years from now, 10 years from now.
Sheldon, you're telling me the surplus that Washington is floating, that Congress is floating, is not real? And let me put it a different way. They're talking about a 5-year projection of surpluses. Two-part question. How real is this whole concept?
Well, the first response is there are 5-year projections that the Congressional Budget Office projects and 10-year baseline budgets. Those are mystical numbers. Bob Reischauer, who's at Brookings, used to be the director of congressional budget. He says that 1-year projections you can take pretty seriously, but 5-year projections have very little validity. And he, of course, was in charge of putting those projections together. It's just too far out in the future. They could turn out to be close and right, but that would be an accident. There's just too many assumptions built in there. But even if it's true, we have a $200 billion surplus over the next 5 years. It's not clear what we're really talking about measure. That doesn't necessarily mean the economy is any more healthy than if we had a $200 billion deficit over the same 5 years. It's not really an accurate measure of any economic indicator of any statistic.
Let's push on. We're going to run out of time. With that surplus, assuming that it's there, the Republicans are talking about tax cuts, and the Democrats, they can word it any way they want, are talking about social programs.
That's correct.
Either of them, in your opinion, hold water?
Well, those are what the two political parties, how they want to spend money. And suddenly they have this freedom. Looks like there's actually some money to play around with. In the past, it's been very tight for the last 10 years with the budget deficits. I think it would be unwise to do either to increase spending programs, although there are programs that are needy that have been cut back over the years. Likewise, it would be unwise to start talking about massive budget cuts, tax cuts. Bill Archer is talking about a much bigger tax cut than what we had in '97 for next year. That's spending the money too early. We don't have it in the pocket yet. Much wiser thing to do would be to look at some mild reforms of the tax code.
Let me jump in right there. Mild reforms, they're going to have to wait a segment or wait a commercial. When we come back, Sheldon will tell us about those mild reforms. Stay with us. We'll be right back.
So what makes Harry's fun is that the mix every day is different.
I like the atmosphere. I like the people that come here. A lot of my friends come here. The food is terrific.
A good restaurant, all things are in balance. The food, the service, and the atmosphere. Although we're famous for beef, we serve a tremendous amount of fresh seafood here. That is a fresh fish. That red snapper was just caught. With seafood, freshness is really the key to quality.
And the food here is terrific. It's the best.
While we have a diverse and varied menu, we're still known everywhere for prime rib. Nobody serves prime rib like we do. We buy the best possible beef available. We age it. We coat it in seasonings and spices, and then we slowly roast it. Now that's tender beef. Harry's is a neighborhood restaurant, and it's open to whatever people want to do. Harry's is a classic that's fun.
Harry's Savoy Grill, Namens Road, Wilmington.
What do you want most from a financial institution? If you're looking for quality, service, and convenience, then look into Delaware Federal Credit Union. They've been serving Delawareans for over 35 years with financial products and services. And Delaware Federal continues to expand with offices and ATMs statewide to serve its members. They're currently serving over 70 employer groups as well as their family members. Membership eligibility is easier than you think. Call 739-4496 for more information about Delaware Federal Credit Union.
The traditions of quality craftsmanship and pride in a job well done are still carried on by the professionals at P.J. Fitzpatrick Incorporated. P.J. Fitzpatrick is the area leader for vinyl siding, replacement windows, and new porch and deck installation. Stop by the showroom for an informative demonstration of famous brand windows and doors and pick up a coupon good for up to $1,000 off your purchase. P.J. Fitzpatrick guarantees all work and has the experience and reputation to get your job done right. Call today, 325-2360.
Welcome back to Financially Speaking. My guest is Sheldon Pollack. We're talking about tax policy, and I'll simplify it. Surplus may or may not be there, but making the assumption it is. The Democrats are talking about social programs, the Republicans are talking about tax cuts, and Sheldon is saying, hey, compromise might be...
Well, a good opportunity to try to clean up some of the mess in the tax code. As opposed to this idea, I think it's fairly simplistic. There are bills introduced by Republicans in this Congress to have the income tax expire in the year 2000. The income tax brought in $919 billion in 1997. I don't think we want to have it expire without a replacement. What's a good chance to do is clean up some of the mess. There are some provisions in the tax code that are unnecessarily complex.
Such as?
Well, one problem is the capital gains tax, which was one of the major elements of the tax cuts in 1997, were for capital gains, increased enormously the complexity for average person filling out their tax returns, as well as people in the securities industry, such as yourself. It's just a nightmare trying to figure out the new 3 categories of holding periods for assets. That's just totally unnecessary, and nobody really seemed to want it.
You've spent a lifetime, a career at least, analyzing tax policy. Your thoughts on the 1997 Tax Act?
Well, my thoughts are pretty much the sentiment of tax professionals, accountants, and tax attorneys think it's a nightmare. It did very little that was useful in terms of simplifying tax code. It added enormously to the complexity. It was really a retreat to old tax bills that were politically motivated, giving lots of little benefits to different groups, educational credits, all sorts of investment credits, and it didn't do anything. The same people that we're talking about a flat, simple tax are really the people that brought us a much more complex tax. And so some of the problems going ahead are created from 1997 and a lot of old acts as well. That could be improved a little.
I know enough about, in our private conversations, the main thrust of 1993, the former Tax Act, was to basically whack the rich Was that a good idea or a bad idea?
Well, I think it was a bad idea. It was directly targeted, the tax increase in '93, which President Clinton says is responsible for the surplus.
Is it?
More likely the reason the surplus is there, if it shows up, is because the economy has been very strong.
Right.
It may not be that strong over the next 5 years. '93 raised taxes only on the wealthy, and for that reason I think it was unwise legislation because it was targeted towards a specific class. I think we should, if we're going to share the burden of the tax that pays for our expenditures, it should have been a broader tax increase. I would suggest repealing the '93 provision that increased the taxes on those earning more than $250,000 and raised marginal taxes to 39.6%.
I've heard you say two different things, though. On one side, I heard you say the flat taxers didn't have a real, it was not the answer in a previous segment that we just did, and I just heard you say taxing the rich, which would be a direct attack on the progressive system, perhaps ain't the answer. Sheldon, if you can't be progressive, you can't be flat, what type of tax system should we have?
Well, I think what we should have is kind of a moderate incremental tax policy, which makes adjustments, minor adjustments, as opposed to proposing radical reform of the tax code, which politically is not feasible anyway, nor is, I think, a radical change in Social Security likely. We're not likely to see that kind of radical change like privatization, even if we really decided it was best. And so rather than scrapping the income tax or adopting the flat tax, which is a very radically different tax code, I think we should just change the margins. One thing is we can make it a little bit flatter. You don't have to have a single tax rate. We could have 3 tax brackets. We can eliminate a lot of the complex provisions. I would advocate simply repealing the federal estate and gift tax. It raises very, very little money every year. Very, very few, only about 1.5% of the population is ever subject to the estate tax, and yet it imposes enormous complexity and planning. People pay a lot of money to organize their wills to take into account federal estate taxes. That is very unnecessary. The tax doesn't raise enough money to justify that kind of compliance cost. That would be a good place to use a little bit of the surplus to get rid of that whole tax system.
We got to wrap it up. If I had to put it in a sentence or a word, put some common sense to it. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Sheldon Pollack, University of Delaware. Been a great guest, and we'll see you back
Dave.
in 2 weeks for more Financially Speaking.